So back in the late 70s, when I was still in middle school, my mom and dad went through a really nasty divorce. When dad disappeared for a week, mom tried to reassure me and my brother by saying that he was on a work trip. But when he came home, they spent the next couple of days arguing before he left for good. Now, he didn't disappear or anything. He moved up to Crescent City into a nice house by the harbor. But since he didn't fight for custody, we kind of got this sense that he just wasn't interested in being a dad anymore. The most he ever talked about it was when he called on my 26th birthday. Mom never had a good word to say about him after the divorce, and she said he was a deadbeat, that he'd gone nuts, that he was off someplace having a midlife crisis because he was a selfish, thoughtless a-hole. Dad laughed when I told him that, and he didn't disagree either. He also apologized for being so distant, but explained his life had taken a horrible turn right around the time he and Mom divorced. He said I might not understand till I was a dad myself, and that sometimes a man has to do what's right, even if it means sacrificing everything he's worked for. He sounded pretty drunk at the time, so I've never really put much thought or faith into what he had to say. And I didn't know it at the time, but that was the last chance that I'd ever get to talk to him. Around 7 months later, Mom called me in the middle of the night. All she said was, "Your father's dead." And then she passed the phone to my brother so he could talk. Dad suffered a heart attack while taking a swim in his backyard pool. No one found him for a couple of days, and Mom had to go identify his body. She came home drunk in a cab and had to go pick up her car the next day. We held a closed casket funeral for Dad in the week that followed. Then me and my brother helped Mom deal with all the inheritance stuff. Dad did pretty well financially, so we were shocked to learn that he barely had any left when he died. All he had was his car, his house, a few thousand in savings, and one other thing. A property up near Black Marble Mountain, one he had built not long after the divorce. And that was the biggest shock of all, because not even Mom knew that he had anything built, and she knew almost everything that he'd been up to after the divorce. According to the attorney Mom hired, it was a one-room log cabin built on a small plot of land up in Siskiyou County, about 20 miles south of a little town called Happy Camp. We could either have it evaluated and put it on the market along with his house, or the attorney could transfer the deeds and we'd be the proud owner of a cabin we didn't even know existed until just a few minutes before. Mom told the attorney to put the place up for sale, but I asked her not to be so hasty. She argued that there'd been nothing in that cabin but jerky wrappers and empty bottles of booze, but that didn't deter me. I later told her in private that I wanted to see for myself. My brother and I didn't know all that much about what Dad had been up to, and since only one of us gave a crap, it was up to me to go check the place out. I drove up in mid-November of that same year, making sure all the wildfires in the area had either burned out or been contained, but it wasn't a case of just driving out to the thing and loading my car up with anything of interest. Accessing the cabin took hours of hiking across unfamiliar terrain, and we grew up in a family that was more familiar with spas and resorts than hiking or camping. Preparing for the trip took months of purchases and planning, and by the time I was finally ready, I remember feeling very, very apprehensive. I wanted to know what my dad had been up to out there, if he was just a latent appreciator of the outdoors, or if there was some deeper meaning to it all. But I never stopped to consider if maybe, just maybe, I was better off not knowing the answers to my questions. Now, I'm not talking about anything too sinister. More like I didn't want to see the evidence of degenerate alcoholism or worse, some kind of weird BDSM setup. So there was this sort of creeping apprehension as my day of departure approached, just not nearly enough to stop me though. And after driving out to Happy Camp, a friendly local directed me down to a place called Cottage Grove. There was a whitewater rafting company based down there who wouldn't mind me leaving my car parked overnight. And then from there, it was almost 5 miles of hiking out towards Black Marble Mountain, and all I had to go on was a map the attorney had procured on my behalf. And it was hard going. I soaked my shirt with sweat, got myself lost a couple of times, and burned through so much of my water that I had to top my canteen up with some stream water. and it warmed up fast, and the chlorine tablets made it taste like a swimming pool. And then after a few more hours, the trees started to thin out, and I actually spotted the cabin in a distant clearing. And I was kind of expecting something fancy, like maybe some luxury man cave Dad could retreat to whenever he needed to luxuriate, you know? But seeing it from a distance, I could tell right away that it was anything but luxurious. It was moldy and moss-eaten, and the front was all scratched up, presumably from where generations of bucks had been using it as some rutting post. It had one small window on its front with no glass or a shutter, and the roof looked like it was about to fall in. I tried the door thinking that it was fit to fall off, but it proved surprisingly sturdy. It was thick with these metal hinges, and what I realized were metal panels that had been nailed to the other side. But that only caught my attention for a second or two before I turned to the cabin's interior. And when I did, my jaw absolutely dropped. Almost every surface was covered in maps of the area, and all of them had been heavily written on. There was a lot of camping-related trash around it too. Spent gas canisters for this portable stove, empty cases of water, all that sort of thing. But dotted among the maps were photographs of what I came to realize were the same man. It was clear that this place was not newly built. Either maybe he renovated it or built on top of it, but it had been around for a while. Some were pinned to the walls, others were lying on the table or nightstand, and while they weren't in sequence, they seemed to show this guy in a very disturbing state of deterioration. There were a couple of photos showing a very happy-looking man with red curly hair posing with family or friends. In those pictures, he looked bright and healthy, but in other pictures, some of which looked like he'd taken himself, he looked increasingly tired and very gaunt, almost like he was sick. And then there were the pictures of the red-haired man that looked like he didn't know that they were being taken. There was one of him staring into a stream, his previously short hair very long and unkempt, and then another slightly blurry picture of him walking barefoot and shirtless through the trees. There were no clues to who the man was, only that someone had been using the maps to track his movements. There were little annotations with dates and times, and one of them said, "He's still here," over a certain grid square. It looked like my dad had been either trying to find the guy or was tracking his movements. But why was the question. I started to search the cabin a little, looking for something that would give me a clue as to what Dad was up to. But the only things I found were this very hefty-looking revolver in a desk's drawer and a box of .44 ammunition to go with it, and a couple of empty booze bottles, just like Mom had said. There was no running water, no bathroom or sink to wash myself in, and from what I could tell, Dad had spent an awful lot of time there doing something that I couldn't figure out. There was a cot and nightstand in one corner where Dad had obviously stayed overnight a bunch of times. So I dusted it off, tossed my bag down on it, and then took a walk around the area to get a better feel for the place. I wanted to know what had drawn my father to that particular area, and after seeing all those maps and photos, I had a feeling as to what was going on, just not enough to know for sure. He had those additions to that cabin built in that specific spot for a specific reason, but nothing about the surrounding area gave me any clues to what was actually there. And as far as I was concerned, this was a perfectly normal patch of forest that was home to nothing more frightening than the occasional bear with their cubs. But that night proved otherwise. After making my way back to the cabin, I made myself some food, and then as the sun started to set, I went about reading the maps that were thrown around by the light of my electric lantern, and there were some other notes written over certain grid squares that said things like, "Found him sleeping here," or "Human scat? Feeding?" all of which made me think that Dad was tracking the man with that red hair. But then there was the note that said, "Almost saw me, too close," with the "too close" having been written in big block letters. That and the gun made me realize that whatever happened to him, the red-haired man had somehow posed a threat to my father, and since I was now in the cabin, he might just pose a threat to me too. Now, notes like "made contact today" gave me hope, but then others, quote-unquote, secondary contact, bad reaction, made me think that sleeping there was just not such a good idea after all. But then knowing that it was too late to do anything about that, without risking getting lost in the dark, made me feel very, very uneasy. Once it was completely dark outside, I bolted the cabin door shut, closed the little shutter on its only glassless window, and then tried and failed to get comfy on the canvas cot. And that proved just about impossible for a while. But with the sound of the wind in the trees creating this very soft, incessant drone, and with the exhaustion of the day's hike finally setting in, I eventually found myself drifting off to sleep. I don't know how long I was out for, but I was jolted awake around 2:30 in the morning after hearing a noise. My heart began pounding, and I looked all around the cabin for the source of the noise. Then I realized, with relief, that it was coming from outside the cabin. Something was moving out there, and at first, I thought that it had to be an animal of some kind, curious probably of the smell of food. But as I listened, I started to hear this very steady, bipedal shuffle that sounded way too confident to be an animal. Now, the first thing I did was go for the desk, where that very chunky revolver was sitting in the drawer. Now, I'm not exactly some hotshot with guns, but I knew how to load and operate it so it was ready to fire. An animal would just leave given some time and possibly a warning. But a lone person out there, in the middle of the night, was definitely worth arming myself for. My next move was to that small shuttered window, which I very swiftly unshuttered and shined a flashlight out of. I had a wide enough arc to illuminate what was directly in front of the cabin, but not much else. But as I scanned, that rhythmic shuffling noise sounded like it was getting closer and closer to my field of vision. I pointed my flashlight beam over to some of the trees to my right, then, after a few seconds of waiting, a person shuffled into view. They were completely naked, with only patches of clean, pale skin visible through this covering of dirt and grime. Their long red hair was knotted and wild, and I caught a glimpse of a very similarly unkempt beard, too. I knew who it was from the moment I saw all that hair, but as I shined my flashlight on him, he didn't react at all. He just kept walking side on to me like he was circling the cabin, and he kept going that way for about a minute or two before he suddenly just stopped. Now, at first, all I could do was just watch, stunned into silence by what, or more like who I was seeing. But when the guy paused and stood perfectly still like some creepy statue, I knew that I couldn't stay silent any longer. I called out to him, saying something like, "Hey, I'm warning you. I got a gun in here." But he didn't react to the sound of my voice either. He stayed almost perfectly still aside from this very subtle swaying. And then out of nowhere, he suddenly started sprinting towards the cabin door. And the way that he went from 0 to 60, it scared the crap out of me. So I slammed the shutter closed and then backed away from the front wall of the cabin and pointed the gun right at the door. I saw those metal plates again, and it suddenly made this horrible sort of sense why they'd been added. I thought the guy was going to throw his weight into the door to try and bash it open, but right as his footsteps got very close, they stopped, and he seemed to just sort of stand outside the door, quiet and still again. I reminded him that I had a gun, and that breaking into a cabin would be the last thing he ever did. And you guessed it, he didn't say crap in return. There was just this dead silence for a minute or two before he started gently knocking on the cabin door. It was really soft and quiet at first, barely even audible, but it got louder and harder with each repetition. I figured it was a fist at first, but the longer it went on, the more I realized that the impact was much larger, and it was exactly at head height too. That crazy bastard wasn't banging his fist against the cabin door. He was smashing his head into it, over and over and over again. I remember yelling at him to stop, while staring straight at those metal plates thinking, Jesus Christ, This has happened before, hasn't it?" As the guy kept slamming what I assumed was his head into the thick wooden paneling, I started yelling at him that I wasn't my dad and that he'd passed away. I didn't phrase it exactly like that. It was much more drawn out, and I must have sounded terrified. But I drove the point home that Dad was gone, and I wasn't staying. And then the moment that I made that point, the banging suddenly stopped. There was dead silence again for a moment or two, and then I heard a voice outside saying my dad's name. It was a raspy kind of croak, like whoever was outside hadn't drank or said anything in a long, long time. But it was clear enough for me to recognize his name. I told the guy for a second time that my dad had passed, and then in the morning I'd leave and never come back. But his only response was to croak Dad's name again, a little louder. I yelled at him that time, shouting about how Dad was dead, how I didn't know what the hell he'd been up to, and that I didn't mean anyone any harm by being out here. I expected him to repeat Dad's name again, but the silence drew itself out until suddenly I heard footsteps getting gradually quieter as whoever it was began to walk away. I remember just standing there, unable to move but also unable to stop shaking as I listened to those footsteps get more and more muted, until finally I couldn't hear them anymore. Hearing only silence again felt like a spell being broken. I could move again, but I also couldn't stop moving. There was no way that I was sleeping in that cabin that night, not after that. So I packed up my stuff, made sure that I was headed west, and then walked until I saw the sunrise. But that night hike was one of the most terrifying experiences of my entire life. Not only did I notice that the cabin door was drenched in what looked like saliva on the way out, or blood, but I mistook every little shadow on the edges of my flashlight beam for that naked, red-haired man. The same could be said for every little sound I heard, too. I heard an owl or something hooting behind me, and I'd spin around on the spot with my flashlight and my dad's gun at the ready. I honestly thought that I was going to have to kill a man that night, and I thank God that it didn't come to that. I also didn't feel truly and completely safe until I was back in my car and on the move again. By the time I got back home, I hadn't slept in more than 24 hours, but I was still so wired after all that adrenaline that I didn't even think about sleeping until late that same afternoon. I called the Ranger HQ at Yukonam to report what I'd seen, and told them how concerned that I was for whoever was out there. I mentioned how I believed my late father had been trying to find a missing person, but I didn't mention anything about the tracking or the observation he'd done, nor did I go into detail regarding that horrifying encounter of the previous night. All I said was that guy seemed dangerous. I didn't want the ranger thinking that I was some crazy attention seeker. And then once it was his turn to speak, the ranger told me something very shocking. He said that I wasn't the first person to make a report like that, concerning some red-headed wild man living out there in the woods. I probably wouldn't be the last either. But to date, he hadn't hurt anyone. He'd just give them a scare, especially considering his lack of clothing and, obviously, strange behavior. The oldest filed report was from 15 years before, which coincidentally was right around the same time that Mom and Dad was getting divorced. I asked if my dad's name was among any of those who'd made reports, but the ranger said no. Before we hung up, the ranger suggested the guy was an old-time friend of my dad's, who'd been out there trying to find him. I said it was possible, but I couldn't know for sure. And Mom certainly didn't recognize the guy's description, and neither did she recall Dad ever hanging around with anyone who looked like that. And that was probably the point where I was at my most curious, and I guess there was a time there when I was in danger of falling into what I consider as the same trap as my father did. Now I figured, why sell the place? I can go out there every so often and piece together what Dad was trying to figure out and build. But then I saw myself falling down that rabbit hole of obsession, emptying liquor bottles out there on my lonesome, till I too died long before my time should have been up. Now after that, I put the cabin up on the market. I had to sell the land in the cabin as a kind of parcel, and I sold it at a heavy discount purely because I just wanted to get rid of everything and also because it was so dilapidated and disgusting. The thought of sending someone out there to evaluate it didn't even cross my mind, because I'm not sure if I could have lived with myself if they'd gone all the way out there, only to never return. In 2011, a little boy and his mother vanished on an unplanned road trip, drifting from zoo to hotel as if following some secret plan. Days later, she was found dead, leaving only a chilling note claiming he was safe, but that no one would ever see him again. More than a decade later, there's still no trace of the boy, only whispers of what might have happened in the shadows of those missing days. Listen to more on my true crime channel, Saturn Soul, link down below. In September of 1993, my college buddies and I were just about to start our junior year when we decided to meet up for a camping trip. Now, we'd been talking about it for almost a year, we just never found a time when all four of us could make it. So before classes started, we figured that we'd head out into the boonies for some real call of the wild type stuff, as I like to call it. We picked out Olympic National Park, if you're familiar with it, and it being just a couple of hours drive away. And then combine that with Olympic National Forest. Yes, they're two different places that border one another. We had one of the largest wilderness areas in the lower 48 right there on our doorstep. We drove out on Thursday the 2nd early in the morning with the plan to drive back to Seattle on Monday the 6th. Now, we were full of pep on the drive out there, excited for 3 full days of living wild and free. And then after stopping for some lunch, we drove down to a place called Fairholme, where there was a campground and a general store. And that was our landing zone, if you will, a place where we'd spent our first night before heading out into the trails the next morning. And from there, we'd hike out to the lookout, soak up the views from our campsite on the mountain, and then just lazily make our way back to the car, which was supposedly supposed to go through like a rainforest, which we'd heard was like stepping onto an untamed planet. I'm not even joking. The first night was a heck of a lot of fun, and then we passed through that rainforest on the next morning's hike, confident that we were heading in the right direction. And you couldn't miss the range of hills that we were headed for, so getting ourselves completely lost was just about impossible. But eventually, there came a point where we realized that we weren't on the trails that we thought we were. Not that it bothered us much. We knew that if we kept heading pretty much westward, we'd spot the lookout sooner or later. But what we didn't count on was how thick the trees were. It got to the point where, although we knew what direction we were headed in, we had absolutely no clue where we were exactly. And then after walking through endless trees for what felt like hours and hours, we came across the cabin. And it was so worn down and weathered that it was almost camouflaged against the backdrop of trees. The roof was completely covered in dead leaves, and there were vines creeping up one side, and these glass windows were so dirty that it almost looked like there was clouds inside. It looked completely abandoned, and after peeking through the windows, we saw inside was covered with what looked like old camping stuff. On a table, there was just crumpled up aluminum foil, a half-empty box of matches, and a dented tin can with a spoon crusted in dried beans. Scattered around the floor were torn wrappers from granola bars and a spilled bag of actual trail mix, and there was also an unzipped and stained sleeping bag slumped against one wall, next to a pile of damp firewood that somehow never made it to the cabin's stone fireplace. And after pushing open the unlocked door, I saw a deck of playing cards scattered across the floor as if a game was just kind of abandoned mid-play. And there were also faint carvings on the walls too, stuff like initials, dates, and just some very crude sketches. And we agreed that we were looking at some kind of hiker's stopover, and that'd be the perfect place to rest for a few hours before we carried on towards that lookout. And then after sweeping away some of the trash with our boots and broken branches, we settled in to have some lunch. After sitting on the porch and heating stuff up with our little camp stove, I decided to explore the cabin a little. I figured that I might be able to salvage something from the debris, and then since it was all trash in the main room, I decided to push my way into the bedroom to see if there was anything there. One of us had already taken a look, but he hadn't checked all the drawers in the old nightstand on account of it being covered in just a bunch of cobwebs. And the old stained mattress in the corner reeked of just rotten mold and dampness to the point that I almost covered up my nose and mouth as I checked the nightstand's drawers. And the first thing I saw when I opened the first drawer was what looked like a used condom, so I slammed that thing shut again because, good God, that's gross. Now, the second drawer had a bunch of empty glass medicine bottles with faded prescription labels. But then when I opened up the third drawer, I discovered it contained some kind of leather-bound notebook. I pulled it out of the drawer, opened it up, and saw that it was someone's journal, with the first entry dated in 1978. I didn't imagine it to be really that interesting, like maybe some hiker just forgot his journal or something, but after reading that first entry, I'll be honest, I was hooked. The journal had been started by someone who was right at the beginning of what they called an adventure of a lifetime, and detailed their plan to basically live off the grid for the rest of their days. They talked about how incompatible they were with modern society, and how they knew that they'd be much happier out there on their lonesome while living off the land. The journal was supposed to be an effort to document their adventures, in the hopes that it would serve as a sort of guide to other folks who wanted to escape modernity and embrace nature. Now, as you can imagine, I was actually pretty psyched to have found something like that. I'd gone from thinking that it'd be filled with some terrible poems to being like, damn dude, I could probably get this published if I tried. I walked back into the main room and told the gang about what I'd found, but not everyone was into it. Two of them were too fixated on trying to clear the cabin's old chimney and had this total whatever reaction to me announcing my find. But my buddy Steve then says, "Really? No way." And we sat down on the porch's steps and started reading through the journal together. Now, like I said, the first entries mostly detailed what the guy wanted to do and how he wanted to do it and what he hoped to achieve. But then as they continued, there was a lot more of the nitty-gritty survival stuff that I was actually hoping for. We found the entry from the day the guy ran out of store-bought food and had to rely on what he'd been hunting, catching, and foraging. It sounded scary, but exciting too, and it was thrilling to read how happy the guy was as everything he'd worked towards was starting to pay off. But then came the part where the guy accidentally poisoned himself with some undercooked game, and he got really sick for a couple of days. Now, I felt his anxiety when he wrote about how much it had sucked to die from something as crappy as food poisoning, and we were stoked when we read the entry about how he was starting to feel better again. Now, after reading through a couple of more entries, Steve was starting to get a little bored, so he walked off to help the others to try and start a fire in the cabin's fireplace. But I kept going on, and I'll never forget what I ended up reading. Unsurprisingly, a lot of the entries got kind of samey after a while, for lack of a better word. The journal's author did pretty much the same routine over and over again, with only the most minor of differences from day to day. And that meant that I went skipping ahead a lot to see if I could find any longer, more interesting entries. I watched as entries from 1979 bled into those from 1980, and as they did, they got less and less frequent. But then as 1981 slipped into 82, the style of writing started to change, and sometimes quite dramatically too. What were once elegant passages of prose degenerated into something more primitive, and it wasn't like he was talking to the reader anymore, like you were a friend. It was more like he was talking to himself, or like trying to talk to God. There were long rambling tracks about how he could hear the sky sing when it got really quiet, or how sometimes when he's killing a rabbit or a pigeon, it kind of felt like he was slaughtering his own self in some weird protective kind of way. He talked about how he wasn't just out there to find a new way of living anymore. He was out there to save his soul in some great game between the devil and the Almighty. Now, it was clear that he was losing it a little from the isolation, but the guy seemed to know it too. He acknowledged how bad it was affecting him, and he knew he needed to go spend some time among other people to just sort of soak up some civilization for a while. But he also wrote about how he couldn't bring himself to do it, how much he'd come to hate regular people, and how wasteful and mindless they are. It was kind of sad, reading about how this guy's quest to enlighten himself had turned him so bitter and reclusive. But then as the mid-1980s rolled into the latter half of the decade, the entries weren't just sad anymore, they got downright scary. Some of the later entries were short, clipped, and extremely angry sounding, with the letters seeming like they'd been scratched into the page. Then in 1989, some of the entries weren't even written in actual script. It was all just squiggles and shorthand only the writer must have been able to understand. When there were words I could understand, they were mostly curses or these weird compound words like kill death, blood god, or sick brain. The author wrote how they were angry at God and that something had gone wrong with the world that meant that he couldn't play the game anymore. I remember how one line said something kind of jumbled like, I am not what I am not my offense. I am a cosmic being, and the truth of my rules are the way of the next revealed. I don't think that's what it said word for word, but it was basically the same sort of garbled, almost computer-generated text, like his internal CPU was going very screwy, and there was some other stuff too, but it was just sort of, I am finished. It is finished. I must finish it. Over and over again, sort of like variations on finishing something. And that was the last of what I could read, and the rest was more of that shorthand, the only kind that was a little more intricate and deliberate than the squiggles on the other pages. I figured they had to end soon, that at some point he's going to give up trying to write as he completely lost his mind or finally abandon his little quest. But instead, the entries continued and they somehow got even worse. There were a lot less of them, sometimes only once a month, but the entries continued into 1990, 1991, and 1992. And then right as I'm thinking, no effing way has this guy been out here since the 70s, I turned a page and saw the numbers 1993 just roughly scrawled above another long track of symbols and squiggles. And as a reminder, this story takes place in September of that same year, so when I saw that the final couple of entries seemed almost fresh, with cryptic mentions of the approaching fall, I felt this wave of panic come over me. We weren't at some random hiker's rest stop. We were in some dude's cabin, and that dude was a dangerously insane individual. I rushed inside the cabin and said, "Yo, we gotta get out of here, now." And the whole time we'd been there, it had been peaceful and quiet, so my friends were very confused, asking things like, "What? Why? What's up? What happened?" And I didn't have time to explain everything I'd read, so I just kept saying, "We shouldn't be here. This is someone's place, and they're crazy." There was still this moment of confusion as they responded, "How could you even know that?" And then I say, "Okay, that there's this journal, it's their place, and we need to move." And it wasn't until I flicked through the later pages to show all the symbols and scribbles that my friends realized how serious I actually was about this. And when everything finally dropped, they quit trying to light a fire and we got the hell out of there. It was bizarre how fast the whole mood shifted. One minute we were just chilling in this random cabin, completely content with ourselves out there in nature, and then the next, we were walking as fast as we could with our heads on a swivel, praying that we wouldn't run into the person who'd written that journal. My buddies kept asking me questions on what I'd read, and each answer only got them more and more panicked, wondering what a person like that might have done if they'd found us in their own home. We hiked till we were almost completely wiped and that lookout was finally in sight. Since we were so beat, we agreed to scale it in the morning, and then we hiked up the valley a little to put some more distance between us and the cabin before setting up camp. And after we set up camp, it was hard to get back to normal again. Before we found the cabin, the woods seemed like this big playground, so to think dark corners held dark and dangerous secrets, it really put a damper on things. Now, we weren't armed, which was a major mistake in retrospect, but we were just out for a couple of days hiking and we weren't looking to brave some wild frontier like Lewis and Clark with our muskets at the ready. These days, I'd never go into the woods without something to protect myself, though. But back then, let's just say that we paid for our naivety with fear that we felt that night. We were pretty confident that we were far enough away from the cabin and wouldn't run into its owner, and we were also confident of the numbers because 4 of us and 1 of him made for some pretty good odds. But it was easy to be confident during daylight hours, and after night set in and we were surrounded by darkness, we huddled around our campfire like every shadow was hiding some danger. And I think the anxiety peaked when someone brought up the prospect of him actually tracking us. The guy must have been crazier than a dog in a cat factory, and there was no doubt that he lived out there long enough to be able to hunt and track some game. And we were an unarmed group of 4, having made no real effort to conceal our tracks, meaning that there's every chance that he was sneaking up on us through that darkness, and it scared the living hell out of us. We kept on our guard most of the night, and then as it was approaching 11 p.m., I remember there was this lull in the conversation, as we all went quiet while staring at the campfire. I was actually starting to feel somewhat relaxed again, because if the crazy guy from the cabin wanted to track us, he definitely would have caught up to us by then. I started to think that I might have actually gotten myself into a panic over nothing, because there was every chance that this guy was way out in the boonies and only returned to his cabin every so often to, I don't know, sleep in that stinking mattress or whatever. But that's when we heard the scream. From the other side of the valley, this blood-curdling scream came echoing through the trees. The word scream doesn't entirely fit what we heard either. It was more like a cross between a howl and a roar, one you could hear all this anger and madness in, but also all this pain too. Whoever made that noise was not in control of themselves or their mind, and just hearing it scared the hell out of us. The scream had sort of petered out for no more than a split second when one of my friends says, "That's him." And there was no debate from anyone else. We knew damn well who made that sound. There was no disputing it, and there was no way in hell that we were going to stay hanging out in that same spot. We doused the fire, packed away our tents and the rest of our gear, and then we walked non-stop until we found ourselves back in that general store and where we parked the car. By then, the light of dawn was creeping over the hills in the east of us, and just seeing it felt like salvation. We didn't say much on the ride back. Someone suggested that we should have taken the journal with us, sort of as proof that someone was out there having completely lost their mind. But the rest of us agreed that stealing it would have made the guy even madder than he already was, and that he definitely would have ended up tracking us through the woods had we stolen from him. But having heard that scream that echoed across the valley, I'm not sure that he could have gotten any angrier at knowing his home had been disturbed. Even today, I thank God that he didn't track us down, and I try not to think about what would have happened should that man have found us. I grew up in small-town Montana, and back when I was in my late teens, I used to work as a night porter at some cabins in the mountains. Now, to clarify what that is, it was basic night watchman stuff, making sure everything ran nice and smoothly. And then every so often, I'd get someone calling at the office to check in late or ask a few questions. We just had a VHS player installed at the office, so the night porters would be less tempted to take a nap. So I got into the habit of renting tapes before heading into work so I could watch movies all night. One night at around 1 in the morning, I'm right in the middle of scaring the pants off myself watching the Hellraiser movie, if you remember that, when I hear something moving outside the office. The office had these 2 glass panel windows and a door with a glass panel on it too, so I could see out into the darkness. I just couldn't see who was moving around out there. Sometimes the city folks used to go stargazing, so it wasn't unusual to have people walking around later on at night. So when I first heard it, I didn't think much of it and I just kept watching Hellraiser. But then a minute later, I heard it again. That time, I heard it closer to the office, so I lowered the volume on the TV and listened through the silence. It didn't sound like human footsteps. It sounded like something creeping up on all fours, and it was getting closer. We used to keep a loaded gun in the cache safe for reasons you can probably guess, but it doubled as bear and mountain lion protection too, so the first thing I did upon realizing that there was something creeping up on the office was rush to that safe and grab that gun. I then crept out of the office and into the lobby, which consisted of nothing more than a desk, chair, and logbook along with those big glass windows. As I stared out into the darkness, looking for the source of that shuffling sound, I couldn't see a thing. I kept looking for the reflection of the thing's eyes, partly because I had the bejesus scared out of me on a previous occasion when a coyote turned and looked at me through the darkness and I almost pissed my pants. But even after grabbing a flashlight and shining it out into the darkness, I still couldn't see a damn thing. Then out of nowhere, a man rises up from the ground beneath the window, and I jump back and let out a yell. He had what looked like blood staining their mouth and chin, and there was reddy brown slime all down his shirt. He smeared a little on the window as he tried to steady himself, and then he collapsed back down into the ground. I knew that he must have been hurt in some way, so the first thing I did was run to the phone and dial 911. But then the dispatch lady wanted to know what was wrong with the guy, so I ran back to ask him. The dispatch person then must have assumed that it was alcohol related because she told me to ask the guy what he'd been drinking. I ran outside, asked him the questions, and all he'd do was just groan in response until I finally picked up on 2 words: number 9. Now I respond, Is that a drink or something? I don't know what you mean. But again, all he did was groan in pain. Now I ran back to the phone and told the lady what he'd said about number 9, but then it hit me. He wasn't talking about a drink. He was talking about cabin number 9. I ran back to the phone, made sure that there was an ambulance on the way, and then I ran all the way down to cabin number 9 to check it out. The front door was wide open, and there was more of that reddish-brown vomit on the step. But then inside, it looked like something out of a horror movie. There were 3 other people, 2 passed out on the couch and floor, and 1 standing on shaky legs over the sink. He was puking what looked like a mix of blood and something else in that sink. And then, when he heard me from behind, he says, "Help me, please," then kind of sank to the ground to stop himself from falling. Now obviously I'm asking what did you guys drink over and over, but all the guy could do was point towards the table as he carries on retching and gagging. There were maybe half a dozen bottles of liquor strewn about the cabin's kitchen and dining area. There was wine on the table and various other drinks on the countertop, and it looked like a big meal could have been eaten too. I started to realize that it wasn't just a case of one guy drinking too much. All 4 of them had the same reaction, meaning something they ate must have been really, really past its sell-by date, or they were sick with something that I might well have been in danger of catching as well. I didn't have time to dwell on that last part too much. I just made sure not to touch them or any of that puke, and then I ran back to the office phone to report what I'd found. And in the end, it wasn't just 1 ambulance screeching up the path, it was 4. Once the paramedics were busy treating the folks in cabin number 9, I gave my boss a call at home to let him know what was going on. He was there within the hour, and then we joined the growing crowd of various guests that were gathering around to stare at what was going on. The EMTs got all 4 sick people onto stretchers, and then once they were securely in the back of an ambulance, it would speed off back down the track with its lights flashing, and then we'd hear it hit its siren as it reached the highway. When it all cleared out, my boss couldn't believe the mess that they made in cabin number 9. He said it smelled like blood in there, but there was vomit too, and it wasn't just blood. He wanted to know what the hell had happened, and when he got to the bottom of it, or as much of the bottom as there was to get to, this is what he told me. A lady from Washington State had organized a kind of reunion with some of her old friends, and she just so happened to pick our humble collection of cabins for that. And they all drove out there, happy as can be, bringing wine and food and gifts and all that, And then once they were there, the lady who organized the reunion poisoned their food, cut the phone line to the cabin, and then drove all the way back to Washington while her friends started vomiting and collapsing. That's all the cops knew at the time my boss spoke to them. They didn't know why she'd poisoned her old friends, only that she'd used a bunch of weed killer and rat poison, and if I hadn't called 911 when I did, they probably wouldn't have survived. Growing up, I always thought my grandfather was a very strange guy. He was always very generous with money, and apparently I was his favorite granddaughter, but he was also very cold and aloof with me whenever he came to visit. Mom and Dad said that was just his way. He grew up during the Great Depression, so he had a very tough childhood and dedicated his life to the construction company he founded, so while his business acumen was tip-top, his social skills were obviously very lacking. He lived to a ripe old age and left a very generous amount of money when he passed, and then at his funeral, everyone had nothing but good words to say about him. But the next day, my dad asked me to take a seat in our living room with him and asked if I'd like to know the truth. The way he phrased it had me kind of scared at first because I thought that he was about to reveal some sort of dark family secret. But he laughed as he assured me that that was not the case at all. In fact, he wanted to tell me the story of Grandpa's upbringing and how he became to be the man that he is. I didn't know much outside of the whole Great Depression thing, and it sounded so sad that I never cared much to ask. Yet little did I know, there were parts of Grandpa's childhood that he forbade my parents from sharing ever with me. It was hard to imagine why he might do that, if not to conceal something very shameful or immoral. But as my dad told me the story, it all became clear. So way back when the financial crap hit the fan and Grandpa was still just a kid, my great-grandpa moved his family out of Denver, Colorado, and up into the foothills of the Rockies. They picked out this area of land, cut down all the trees, and then got to work building themselves a small log cabin for themselves to live in. Apparently, it was just a stove, a chimney, and a couple of beds for them to share. Everything else was either outside or non-existent. They'd hunt, fish, laid traps to earn some fresh meat, and they had a small vegetable patch, and my great-grandpa would sometimes take dried meat and skins into Denver to actually trade for some simple luxuries. It was hard living, and they didn't get to enjoy Christmas or birthdays in the same way some other kids did, but they also didn't know any different, so while it was abject poverty, Grandpa had made some happy memories from that time in his life. At least, until the strangers came. Grandpa said they were having dinner when he heard a group of men outside calling his father out of the cabin. His father told his family to climb out of a back window and run for their lives, and then as they're running, Grandpa said that he could hear his father screaming in pain as the strangers broke into the cabin and murdered him. He said that he, his mom, and sisters wandered around the hills for a couple of days, barely eating or sleeping. Then when they returned to the cabin, his mom made him and his sister wait out in the woods almost a whole day while she buried their father and cleaned up the cabin. After that, and at the tender age of just 9 years old, he was the man of the house. He didn't go to school, he didn't get to play around like other kids. Grandpa worked to put food on their table every day of his life. By the time he was 13, he owned a mule named Chip, and he'd ride Chip into a little town called Evergreen to work for a construction company that was based there. That way, they were guaranteed some money to buy food, medicine, and all of that stuff instead of having to rely on what they could hunt and scrounge for. And when he wasn't at work, Grandpa was either fixing up the cabin or butchering game, while his mom cooked and his sister cleaned. He didn't have time or energy for anything else, and one of the things giving him the most trouble was the cabin's chimney. Birds like to nest in it during the summer, and since his father wasn't an expert builder, the construction itself was far from perfect. So while it needed a good yearly clean in early autumn to get it ready for the winter, the bricks seemed to get looser and looser with each passing. On the year of his 18th birthday, just as summer started going into fall, Grandpa got himself ready to clean that chimney. But this time, no sooner has he jammed the brush up there, but a brick comes tumbling down into the fireplace, sending soot and ash all over the place. Grandpa curses his bad luck and then starts trying to put the brick back into place, but he realizes something is sort of half sitting in its place. Grandpa thinks it's a dead bird or something and gets ready to cover his mouth and nose after dragging it out of the nook. But it's not any kind of dead thing that's blocking the brick from going firmly back into place. It's 3 cloth sacks, and in them are dozens of solid gold coins. Not even his mother knew why those men had shown up and killed his father, and that was partly what made it so terrifying and traumatic for them. But after finding those coins, it all suddenly made sense. No one knows if my great-grandpa stole them or there was someone out there who knew that he was up there in the hills with his stash of gold coins. He didn't even tell my great-grandma about them. But finding them up in that chimney changed their lives completely, and within a couple of years, they were living the good life in Denver after Grandpa started up a construction company all on his own. All his life, Grandpa remembered what it was like being so poor that they barely had a pot to piss in or a window to throw it out of. So all he did was work, just like he'd always done, from dawn till dusk, and for the sake of his family. And the reason he was all so strangely frosty with me, despite me being his favorite granddaughter who he showered with gifts on birthdays and Christmas, was because I reminded him of his little sister, the one he'd been so hungry with while out in the woods after listening to their father's dead screams. And after that, I lost all my resentment towards him. It wasn't much. I loved my grandpa and I accepted that he had a little thorniness about him. But after I learned why, I forgave him with all my heart. And I hope wherever he is, he feels both my understanding and my forgiveness. Rest in peace, Grandpa. I love you. Hey friends, thanks for listening.